This morning, I want to begin by sharing with everyone a beautiful Talmudic principle that I came across during my Daf Yomi Talmud studies this week. It's called Lav Hanitak Le'aseh, and it roughly translates to the idea that if we as Jews violate a biblical prohibition, a lav, then there is a way to nitak, to disconnect, to sever the power of that disconnect by going ahead and doing a positive mitzvah, an aseh. So in other words, if you've done something not so great or something not so great has happened, you can sever the power and break the punishment that comes from doing that lav, that negative commandment, by doing a positive commandment in its place. Now, an example of this principle's application that I came across in my Talmud studies has to do with the idea of the eating of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, and specifically the biblical prohibition against breaking bones. Because the Paschal sacrifice is supposed to be perfect in every way, ve'etzem lo tishbaru bo, the Torah tells us that you're not supposed to break the bones at any point during the eating or the point of sacrificing that animal. However, the rabbis then go on to teach us that even though the Torah specifically says not to break a bone, that it doesn't matter. Why? Because lav hanitak la'aseh, the power of the offering the Korban Pesach, of doing that sacrifice in the Bible, is so much more important and so much greater than the severing of that bone, that it's as if you've made up for that negative prohibition. Now, I want to make it clear that the rabbis apply this particular principle very, very narrowly. It's not like you could go to the Marietta diner and buy a bacon cheeseburger and eat it, and then say Birkat Hamazon afterwards and say, well, don't worry, I said Birkat Hamazon, and that nullifies my eating the bacon cheeseburger. It doesn't quite work that way. However, what I love about this principle is that if you think about it more broadly, you see that it applies to so many aspects of our daily lives. How many of us have ever come to a situation where we made a mistake, something terrible happens, only then we are able to rectify it by learning or doing something positive in that moment? In my family, when we go on car trips, by the way, this is what we call happy accidents. We get lost somewhere when we're going somewhere. There's a lot of yelling going back and forth in the car. And then we end up coming somewhere that ends up being a better place than we wanted to be in the first place, and all is forgotten. Or perhaps, in a more serious way, we encounter a moment when something terrible happens. And in that moment of love, of transgression, hanitak le'aseh, we take that moment and we nullify it, we sever it, by turning that terrible moment into a force for positivity. As we approach the holiday of Purim, we're here on Shabbat Zachor, this powerful principle no doubt also resonates with all of us today. Because what is Purim if not a holiday that began with a lav? It began with a terrible moment of transgression and ended up v'nitak le'aseh, ended up as an immensely positive Jewish holiday. Some of you may not know that our rabbis argue that the reason that Purim even happened was because of one of the great sins that took place at the party of King Achashverosh. We're told that there were Jews at the party by the rabbis and that they drank from the vessels that had been captured from the temple in Jerusalem. The Midrash, by the way, is the reason that during the first chapter of the Megillah reading, if you listen carefully, the trope changes. When we come to the words vechelim, vechelim, shonim, we read about the chelim, the vessels. At Achashverosh's party, the dishes were not only just any ordinary dishes, they were the utensils from the temple in Jerusalem. They should have been treated with respect. The Jews shouldn't have eaten from them, but the Jews of Shushan were so thoroughly assimilated and wanted to fit in and were unaware. They were not even aware of the love, that they were violating the prohibition. Only what does Purim teach us, the holiday? Hanitak le'aseh, that the prohibition can be overcome in a moment of triumph. Esther stands up for her Judaism where others forgot. Today we hold carnivals. We're going to have a drive-in Megillah reading. But underlying that joyous holiday, it began with a serious transgression with a love. Whereas Jews, we took our safety and security and our Judaism for granted. The story of Purim begins, in other words, with a broken bone. But that broken bone is rectified by Esther's korban, her sacrifice, and her heroism. Last Shabbat was a reminder of the old rule of thumb, that the worst stuff always happens when the rabbi is on vacation. After Shabbat, and even during Shabbat, I was emailed by many of you. I was called on Shabbat by people who were deeply concerned about what we are calling the Zoom bombing incident that happened last Shabbat. Which is why, having now had a week to gather my thoughts, I want, in light of what we've been talking about thus far, this Shabbat Zachor, to share with you two different perspectives from my point of view about how we can approach what happened. The first perspective must be, and that is so important, that I want to validate the feelings of how many of you are feeling at this moment. You want to feel, and you are feeling, like your security has been shaken, like your sacred space, our synagogue, something was awry. But at the same time, I also want, while validating your feelings, as I so often do, in light of the Purim story we've been talking about, to urge you to also exercise caution. Because a Zoom bombing, as we have come to call it, was not an actual bombing. And I want to point out that we live in Atlanta, Georgia, and we know what a real bombing of a synagogue can actually do. And I honestly wish that we could come up with a better name that wasn't Zoom bombing, because what took place was not an actual bombing. What happened last Shabbat was a horrific act of hate. It was traumatic. But we are not living in Shushan. It wasn't done by a powerful Haman threatening to wipe out all of the Jews. What happened last week was a moronic group of teenagers who I am told, was just told this morning, live in Europe and Nevada. And it was done in an internet that sadly in our day and age gives people the anonymity to do whatever they want, whenever they want to do it with no filters. That's why I want to validate those of you who had your Shabbat ruined by the experience, to also take a step back and to find a little perspective. We're not living in Shushan. No actual bones were broken by the Pesach sacrifice. Mirzain and Doe, we're all still here. Only now that we've all done that together, I want to turn to my second perspective, and it is one that calls on us to remember the principle with which I began this morning. Lav hanitak la'aseh. That when something is violated, whether it is our safety, our security, when a terrible act is committed, we can either ignore it or we have another choice. And that is, we can rectify it and sever the damage done by going and doing mitzvot in the world. And it is here this Shabbat that I want to first publicly commend our outstanding Associate Rabbi Albert Slomovitz, who did exactly that this past Shabbat. After the Zoom incident, we didn't shut down services. He announced our synagogue's new partnership with Must Ministries to feed needy children in our community. And while this wasn't perhaps an intentional juxtaposition, if you think about it, it is in so many ways so appropriate. After all, what could be a greater logical consequence than for children without nourishment acting badly to be fed. We know that children who sometimes grow up in poverty without proper nutrition can grow up to be resentful, perhaps even turning to old prejudices to bear. Only now, with so many of your help, and I want to point out, you guys have no idea how many donations we have gotten already in the past week. We will now feed these children in our partnership with Must Ministries, in partnership with our Jewish community. And that is precisely the kind of nitak le'aseh, the correction, that we need to wipe out this kind of traumatic experience. The people who showed up last week, the hooligans, tried to take control of our Judaism away from us. Now, by participating and giving tzedakah, all of us here are going to take it back. As Jews, there's no question that over the past number of months, we have entered a heightened period and enabled one that which an anti-Semitism is enabled in our society. Anti-Semitism is that great lav, that great transgression of our society at this very moment. So as Jews, in this moment, as we approach Purim, you all know what we need to do. We must this Shabbat and always find perspective, and then we must also find reasons, hanitak le'aseh. We must take the bones that have been broken in the world around us, and we must repair them. We will together, all of us in this space and beyond this space, be a force for good in the world. That's how we're going to succeed and remember this Shabbat Zachor to nullify the hate, that hate that has always existed from the days of Shushan until today. Together, we can and we will make that correction.